You will not take our forest. You will not take our forest. You will not take our forest.
Hi there. Welcome to the Heartwood Forest Protection Podcast, a place where we talk with people who have dedicated their lives to protecting forests. We discuss current threats to our forests, learn what we can do to make a difference, and get to know the people who make up Heartwood and the forest protection movement. Thanks for joining us.
You shine like a diamond in the sun. When others lost you won.
Hi, my name is Jillian Barav, and this is the third of 4 interviews I did with Andy Mahler during the summer of 2025. This one takes place on July 15th. The focal point of our conversation is the devastating Forest Service project called Buffalo Springs, which poses a current threat to the Hoosier National Forest and many private properties adjacent to these public lands, including Andy's own home. True to Andy's form, this conversation meanders a bit, like a river, but it's an enjoyable ride. Thanks for joining me. Good morning, Andy.
Good morning, Jillian.
So we've been having some conversations about your upbringing and what led you to your longtime home at the Lazy Black Bear, how you got into your life's work of forest protection, and the founding of Heartwood. And today I want to talk about what's going on currently in the forest near your home in the Hoosier National Forest and your opposition that you've been organizing against the Buffalo Springs project.
That sounds great. So shall I just start?
Yes, please.
All right. Well, it all started, it's interesting. It started at several different points, and part of it is I'll choose a distinct moment in time and then go backwards and forwards from there. And that distinct moment in time was last year. I believe it was not last year, the year before, in October 2023, as part of the work I did after redirecting my attentions from trying to stop bad things from happening in the forest to trying to create positive alternatives within the community, switching from full-time forest protection activist to becoming more of maybe a community organizer. I don't know what term you'd want to use, but we started the farmers market, and then we started the Lost River Co-op, which has now been in operation for 17 years, I'm pleased to say. But as part of both of those things, the farmers market and the food co-op, I had this intuitive sense, or analytical sense, whatever you want to call it, that one of the things that's critical to creating community and maintaining community is the connections people make through the gathering, preparing, and sharing of food, and through the gathering together to play music together. So I the very first day of the farmers market, I set out 4 chairs and sat there with a guitar in case anybody wanted to sit and play music. And from there, we've been playing music at the farmers market every Saturday since 2002. And then the co-op opened in 2007. And every Wednesday evening, we gathered for music at the co-op. And that's been a great blessing in my life. Met extraordinary people. And there's nothing that really compares to the connection you make playing music with other people, in particular singing harmony. So anyway, I love the music. I organized it within a thoughtful framework, but it was also self-serving in the sense that I just love to have an excuse to and an opportunity to play music with other people, because it's one thing, as you know, to play your own songs at your own speed, at your own time, in your own space. And if you want to change something, you want to reconsider a word, or you forget a word, it's no big deal. But if you're playing with other people, somebody's got to keep the rhythm, and everybody's got to keep the rhythm, and you all have to sort of agree that you're singing the same song at the same time, those sorts of things. And you learn great skills. And I think I mentioned maybe in both of our previous interviews that some of the skills that served me well as an organizer were skills I learned just playing music with other people, how to sort of how to compensate for each other's weaknesses and amplify each other's strengths. And one thing I was always doing is making sure that whatever we were playing, I was playing the simplest possible chords so that anybody who was less experienced than me could watch my hand and figure out what we were doing. Now I don't do that anymore because there are other people who can do that. And what I like to do is just play whatever I feel inclined to play at any given moment. But anyway, so these Wednesday evening gatherings have put me in touch with a lot of local folk who play music. And one of the great blessings, of course, was getting to meet all these old guys, almost all of whom have now passed, who had been playing music their whole lives, and sort of to pick up from them and to experience the joy they brought to their music. And, each of them had a distinctive voice. Each of them had its own styling on the instrument they played. And, it's been so fulfilling and enriching to occupy that space, that musical space, and to share our voices. And, there's a heart connection that gets made when you're singing harmony with somebody. It's just inevitable. But so one Wednesday evening, a young man I know named Stephen Stewart came to the music. He's the son of Frankie Stewart, and they've got a musical family. They've been playing bluegrass forever, and they actually were professional touring musicians for a while. And one of the members of the family was a prodigy. I think he was already performing at age 7, and by the time he was 14, he basically turned pro, and he's still one of the best bluegrass players in the country. He's won several, International Bluegrass Music Federation awards on several different instruments. He's really phenomenal. He doesn't join us. He's been there a few times, but musicians also like to play with other musicians who challenge them and help them to achieve a higher level of greatness and be able to improve their own craft and skill. And sadly, we don't offer that to somebody of his caliber, but nonetheless, his half brother Frankie Stewart has been a regular participant. Frankie is also extremely high class, highly competent mandolin player, and he also plays fiddle and guitar. But anyway, so Frankie wasn't there that night, but his son Stephen came, and he said, and I'd known Stephen a little bit, I'd known the family, but I didn't know Stephen that well. But that was to change. Stephen said, "Andy, did you see the letter from the Forest Service?" And I said, "No, what letter from the Forest Service?" And he went on to describe. I'm not sure if he went into detail or he said just because here's the deal. I'd gotten a letter from the Forest Service in the mail on Wednesday. I probably got it on Monday, or maybe I got the previous Friday. And it was a letter from the Forest Service. And I get lots of mail from the Forest Service because I'm on the mailing list for a few different forests and still sort of keep a track from a distance, although not actively, on what sort of horrors they're perpetrating in these various forests. And I got one from the Hoosier National Forest, and it wasn't just a white, standard envelope. It was one of these 5x7 manila envelopes, meaning that, there's something a little meatier inside. And I had just taken it and thrown it on the couch because, frankly, maybe I had a premonition. I didn't necessarily want to know what was in there, but Stephen said, you've got to look at that, because when his mom opened her copy of the letter, she burst out crying. And that affected Stephen very deeply, that these people would do that to his beloved mother, that they would propose a project that was so horrific, that it would so totally transform their lived experience on a day-to-day basis, that she could see all that in that little envelope. And so, we played music, and I got home and I read it. And it was a proposal, something called the Buffalo Springs Restoration Proposal. And I should mention, we stopped the log on the Hoosier, but it had resumed. Now, not in a big way, but what they were doing is methodically going through the least populated parts of the forest where there was the least public awareness and the least organized public opposition in the past, and coming up with these projects all under the rubric of restoration. They've spent 30 years trying to figure out how to resume their logging program on the National Forest generally, and the Region 9 and the Hoosier. And they had they'd settled on this term restoration. And, it's really, it's language abuse. but even a group as respectable as the American Bird Conservancy, ABC, has bought in. Of course, the National Wild Turkey Federation, WTF, is bought in. The Ruffed Grouse Society, all these organizations, all these not-for-profit organizations are receiving literally millions of dollars from the Forest Service to provide cover for the Forest Service in the terms of, yes, there's no question that there's some bird species that benefit from abused and degraded landscapes. Those birds predominated in south central Indiana after the clearing of the forest, and their numbers since have dwindled as the forest returns to something more akin to a forest and less akin to a clear-cut site or a former farm field. And so they've assembled their team, they've got their scientific premise established, they've got basically permission from the courts, they have not encountered significant broad public opposition. Those of us who've been involved certainly can see through this stuff and do our best to challenge these proposals. And other groups had challenged the previous largest project in the history of the Hoosier, something called Houston South, which is 2 counties north and east of here. And these projects, what the Forest Service is doing at the national level is, rather than analyzing each individual project on its own merits, they're assembling a whole suite of projects over, in many cases, thousands or tens of thousands of acres. And in western forests, there are individual projects that are far larger than the entire Hoosier National Forest. And then they want to do them with something called a categorical exclusion, which is within the framework of the National Environmental Policy Act. There are 3 different levels of analysis. There's the full environmental impact statement, which requires a range of alternatives and a hard look. Then there's something called an environmental assessment, which is less than the EIS. And then there's something called a categorical exclusion, or a CE. So you got the EIS, the EA, or the CE. And each of those requires a different degree of analysis. So a lot of these projects, where they can get away with it, they're doing with a categorical exclusion. And the example they use for categorical exclusion is something so routine and whose impacts are so well established as to not require any great depth of analysis. They call it, it's like mowing the grass at the ranger station. And of course, what they're proposing in the West is logging and burning over hundreds of thousands of acres, and they're calling it routine and, and no impact. And these impacts aren't just the immediate impacts, but the cumulative impacts that are supposed to be analyzing, not just of what's happening on the public land, but what's happening on adjacent private land. So they're proposing now here for this area of Orange County, where I live, and a little part of the county to the south of here, Crawford County, what is now the largest project ever proposed in the history of the Hoosier National Forest. It's a 30,000 acre area within which 18,000 acres of that land is publicly owned and 12,000 acres of that land is privately owned, including, for instance, our own land and the land owned by Frankie and Sally Stewart and all of our other dear friends. I mean, within the music circle that night, there were at least 4 other people besides me who live immediately adjacent to the Hoosier National Forest and whose land and lives would be deeply impacted by the effects of this project if it were to be carried out. Because what the project called for was over 5,000 acres of logging, including over something like 1,500 acres of clear cutting, and burning over 15,000 acres repeatedly every 3 to 5 years for up to 25 years. Now, not burning the whole 15,000 acres at a time, but doing a spot burn here, spot burn here, spot burn here, and cumulatively 15,000 acres every 3 to 5 years over the life of the plan. And then they wanted to spray like 800 acres with herbicide, and they wanted to build 19 miles of either reconstructed road or new road. And they wanted to take, for instance, the horse trail. We live right next to the Youngs Creek Horse Camp. They wanted to take that Youngs Creek Horse Trail and convert it into a logging road for up to 10 years, during which time it would be closed to the public. Of course, this runs right past our driveway, this horse trail does. And, the thought of having logging trucks running past our driveway day after day for 10 years or up to 10 years, hauling off the forest that is not just a bunch of board feet to me, that is my friends, my neighbors, my relation, my family, my surroundings, my home. And then I was dealing with, I've been dealing with the cancer at the same time. So this notion that I could sort of remain on the sidelines got me to evaporate immediately. And of course, I never even contemplated remaining on the sidelines. I knew that this was perhaps going to be the fight of my life, that, they had lined up all their ducks. And they had lined up all their ducks such that they were pretty certain they weren't going to have to deal with the pesky populace and the annoyed neighbors, because they had the support of the State Division of Natural Resources. They had the support of the Nature Conservancy. They had the support of all the wildlife organizations, Wild Turkey Federation. And they had, of course, the support of the timber industry. And to some extent, they even had the support of the previous Republican governor, in that his head of the Department of Natural Resources was very much in favor of this. He's a big, big timber cutter. And he had, you have to wonder about the choice of placing this largest project in the history of the Hoosier National Forest right on top of and all around the home of one of the people who's been a principal obstacle to their timber cutting in the past, whether that was coincidence, just, short-sightedness, or lack of institutional memory, or vindictive, And I think there's several people who are persuaded that it's vindictive, and it may be, but it almost doesn't matter. And of course, there are those who question whether the impacts of this proposal might have had some impact on my health as well. None of these things will ever be known for certain, but I did know that I was not going to sit idly by and watch this happen. So Stephen convened a meeting, and he put the word out, and I sort of dusted off my activist clothes and rejoined the fray, 30 years later, essentially. The first meeting was at a place called the Greenfield Township Community Building. And it's, a small group, ragtag. We're dealing with an agency with a staff of 35,000 people, a budget in excess of $9 billion, something like that. These numbers fluctuate, of course. And we are like maybe 12 people. If we pooled our resources that day, we might have been able to come up with $400 or something. So, what we had was just absolute determination and dedication, because at least two other people who came to that meeting said when they received that envelope, they broke out crying. Because the disconnect between what they claimed to be trying to do and what we all knew it would look like on the ground was as stark as could be. And, since that time, I'll just point out something else, and that is that they've had a very aggressive surveying process in place where every corner, every line in the Buffalo Springs area was getting marked in highly visible fashion. They make these gashes in the bark of trees to where it gets past the bark and down to the sapwood. And then they have this extremely garish red paint that they will paint the wounds with red paint almost as if they were bleeding. And then they set these orange posts. So all around our house and our property now, there are these orange marks. Now, this wasn't true at the time of that first meeting, these orange posts and these red marks. But it's, you drive around the county roads and everywhere you see these red marks and these orange posts. Basically, it's helpful to know where these property lines are, but their determination to mark these lines was a clear indication that they wanted, as soon as they got their internal decision-making process to approve this, and there was no doubt in anybody's mind that was already pre-approved, but they still had to go through the motions of fulfilling their responsibilities under the National Environmental Policy Act, that as soon as they got the approval, they would start immediately. Maybe not with the logging, because with logging you have to advertise the sale, solicit bids, and then choose among the bids and so forth. But with these burn projects, they could start immediately, or seasonally, and with weather appropriate. And as we are speaking here, there's a huge fire on the north rim of the Grand Canyon that is burning out of control, that has consumed the Grand Canyon Lodge there on the north rim of the canyon, a building that stood for over 100 years. And this fire, while they call it a wildfire, is actually a fire that the Forest Service deliberately let burn as a controlled burn that somehow got out of control. And this is not uncommon. The largest fire in the history of the state of New Mexico was a Forest Service controlled burn that got out of control and ended up burning some like thousands of square miles, incinerating homes, wildlife, domestic animals. I mean, you name it. And then, of course, with this aerial spraying of the fire retardant, they polluted some of the most pristine water in the country, in the town of Las Vegas, New Mexico, where these poor people now have to haul in their water, where they used to have some of the purest water in the state. Anyway, back to our story. So I have a great depth of experience of working with the agency. Now, I think I may have mentioned yesterday that every Forest Service employee that was working for the Forest Service at the time I stopped doing my forest protection work has now retired or died or in some other way moved on. But nonetheless, I knew the culture, I knew the agency, and I knew the motivations. I remember back in January of that year having gotten something in the mail talking about this place that doesn't exist called Buffalo Springs. There never has been a place called Buffalo Springs, but now there is. But so I didn't know what they're talking about. So they wanted the public to submit any thoughts or ideas they might have on this area. They wanted to know about the history, the culture, the archaeology, the biology, the hydrogeology, whatever it might be. They wanted to know what the public thought about this area. Well, it's like, what do you mean? Okay, yeah, I mean, but that's the first time we ever saw this term Buffalo Springs. They were doing a project analysis, and their determination was, and I went back and found that and read it, and then I read between the lines. And I said, oh my gosh, why didn't I see this coming? And I should have seen it coming. But I hadn't been tracking the Forest Service that closely because I was very comfortable no longer spending my life dedicated trying to stop other people's bad proposals. I was focused as much as possible on trying to create community, create positive alternatives, create a sense of peace, comfort, joy, purpose in my own life, but in our larger community. So there had been this earlier document, and this document has things like maybe 11 pages long. And in those 11 pages, they talked about all the wonderful features of this area, the geology, the Native American history, the historic and cultural features, the botany, the biology, the aquatic features, the karst features. And then they mentioned briefly, fire and I can't remember what they called it. I doubt they called it timber harvest. They probably called it forest resources or something. A page and a half of this 11-page document extolling the virtues of this Buffalo Springs area. And I'll mention that the name Buffalo Springs, like they had done with the Houston South project, they just picked two names off the topographic map, and within that, the geographic area, in our case, 30,000 acres. And one of the principal features in that 30,000 acres is something called the Buffalo Trace, which was the major travel way from the Falls of the Ohio to the crossing of the Wabash at Vincennes. And Paoli, of course, happens to be halfway across. And that's why part of the reason Paoli is here is because the buffalo stopped here, because it also had this array of springs, some of which are some of the cleanest, purest water you will ever drink, and some which have distinctly noteworthy mineral content, including high sulfur content and various other lithium, various other minerals that the bison and others valued. And so there would be these places along the Buffalo Trace where the bison would stop and stay for a while they wallowed in the mineral mud by the mineral springs and drank from the springs and foraged around on the chestnuts and whatever else would be growing at any given time before moving on to their winter grounds down in the bluegrass of Kentucky or their summer foraging in the prairies of northwest Indiana and northern Illinois and so on. So that was it. Buffalo from Buffalo Trace, Springs from the Springs. And the Springs had not just led the bison to come to southern Indiana, I mean, to what's now Paoli, what's now Orange County, but the Native Americans following the bison and the deer and so forth, but also benefiting from those springs. And then later the pioneer settlers followed this because it was a super highway essentially, because otherwise you're weaving your way between fallen trees and everything. The buffalo had cleared a fairly wide, fairly straight path, and that became the path of settlement and the path of access all the way into what was at one time called the Northwest Territories, which were surveyed, as I mentioned, from a point, a mile and a half south of here on the principal meridian that divided the eastern United States from the western United States. At least that's the way I see it. And so one of the things that had grown up in the area, and obviously timber is a resource. The lands that had been cleared of timber became agricultural resources, and those have been two significant components of the local economy since the earliest pioneer days. But the third one was sort of a little bit of a surprise, and that was people came for their health. These springs were believed or known by the people who paid attention to such things to help people with all sorts of medical ailments. So they actually became a sort of health community component to the local economy as people would come to take the waters, and other people recognizing that this was a place where value and profit could be extracted from natural features, establish rooming houses or sanitariums or other kinds of venues where people could come and have a bed to stay in. And this tended to be, people who were better off, but also people who were in pretty dire circumstances. Hey, maybe I should go over there and try some of those mineral springs. You know what? I'm absolutely determined that there's something in this forest that will heal whatever this condition is I have. And, I don't know why I didn't give some more thought to that earlier. So thank you for this conversation. I'm going to check up on that. Anyway, so over time, it became something quite remarkable. And there's now a very well-developed tourism recreation infrastructure built around the springs. There's two major towns, and major by southern Indiana standards. One called French Lick. People who follow basketball will remember the basketball legend Larry Bird, who came from French Lick and was known as the Hick from French Lick, and whose mom lived here for many years. I actually helped put a roof on his mom's house with my friend Larry Max Plurus back in the day. But anyway, so you've got French Lick Springs and you've got West Baden Springs. And West Baden is unique and noteworthy because it features the largest freestanding dome in the world at the time it was built. Up until the dome at West Baden was built, the largest freestanding dome in the world was St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. And you can tell how many years there were between St. Peter's and when this was built in 1910. So there's a guy named Sinclair, and Colonel Sinclair, and he had owned one of these hotels and made a decent living for himself and his family by operating this, and his hotel burned to the ground. And when it burned to the ground, he dedicated himself to replacing it within a year with a new building that would be built completely out of non-flammable materials. Mm. And what he did is he contracted with an architect named Harrison Albright, who had designed, I think, the state capitol in Charleston, West Virginia. But anyway, he came up with this idea for a round building with a dome top on a metal frame. And the company he worked with was a bridge building company to implement his plan. And they imported tile setters from Italy, and the tile setters laid down a floor of over 12 million tiles in the center of this dome. The dome is 5 stories high. Every room in the dome has either a view of the atrium, inside, which is an amazing space. And they used to have this huge chandelier in the middle of the dome, which would descend just above the floor. And there were seats on there for musicians, and they would have the band playing while they were lowering this thing. And they had circuses in there. This guy who acquired the dome after Sinclair died, a gambler, and he owned casinos back in the 20s, if that tells you anything about his sort of ethical standards. But anyway, Ed Ballard had gotten a hold of this property, and it was described as the eighth wonder of the world. Well, Sinclair built it, and like I say, they built it in under a year, and it's just an unreal, phenomenal architectural gem in the middle of nowhere. Obviously, I don't consider it nowhere, but it did happen to be just about halfway between Chicago and Miami, where Ballard also had interest. Ballard ended up, I know I'm getting into lots of asides here because we're supposed to be talking about Buffalo Springs, but just this stuff fascinates me. Anyway, Ed Ballard's story is an interesting story and deserves to be told, but that's not the story we're telling here, although I did take us a little off into the side to explain how we got this incredible tourism and recreation component and health-based tourism and recreation-based economy here in Orange County. There are these two massive hotels. The other one in French Lick is also a phenomenal building, but it doesn't have the unique charm and the exceptional architectural features of the West Baden Dome. I would love to go into that in more detail at some point, but let's get back to our story. So we got this, part of the area is called Buffalo because of the Buffalo Trace, and part of it is called Springs because of Springs Valley and the various features that distinguish, this landscape in Orange County in particular from any place else in the world. I mean, obviously there are similarities to things elsewhere, including the karst regions of Missouri and Kentucky, but this area there's something magical and charming about Orange County that the longer I stay here, the more deeply I feel it and seek to express it and to protect it. So here we are dealing with this place called Buffalo Springs. It never existed before, but now it does, and it's very, very real to us. The Forest Service has all their ducks in a row. They know that NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, does not require them to make the right decision. It only requires them to go through the motions of caring. They have to pretend to give a hard look to this. They have to pretend to care about alternatives. They had dropped this project right on top of our home. All the areas right around us, I mean, contiguous with our land, right up to our property line, 800 acres of active management between different forms of logging, burning, herbicide spraying, and of course, converting the horse trail that runs past our house into a logging road for up to 10 years. And so we were determined to stop it, but the Forest Service had a fairly clear glide path to getting this thing approved, but they did have to go through the NEPA process. And they said that they were going to do the analysis. This was in October, mind you. They're going to do the analysis and they were going to start implementing the project in April. All I know is that they kept pushing the deadline for when they would start implementing back. And every time we hit one of their deadlines, the logging had not begun, the burning had not begun. We celebrated, but we did not celebrate to the extent that we did not maintain focus. So Stephen had called this meeting at the Greenfield Township Community Building. And we were determined that we were going to work together. But there were a few people thinking, no, we can't say no logging. We have to be willing to accommodate. There might be some places in this project where what they're proposing would actually be beneficial, and so on and so forth. And I was pretty insistent that we talk this through. And I shared with them my experiences, my knowledge about how the Forest Service operates and what the incentives are that were driving the process. And so we all came to a consensus on this. And like I say, in every organization I've ever been involved in, it's not like the majority is going to rule over the minority. We are going to talk this through until we come up with a position that everybody feels comfortable with. It may not have been their first thought, but after talking it through, they say, oh, yes, either I strongly support that or yes, I can certainly live with that. And our position was that we were not going to do anything in terms of a resolution to the Buffalo Springs project that would foreclose any options to those who wanted greater protection. And that our ultimate goal was to stop all the logging in the Hoosier National Forest and to tie those efforts in with people in other states working similarly to protect their forests. So we got to a pretty strong, forceful, deeply held position pretty quickly. And the position was that we are not going to be motivated by what we're opposing. We're going to be motivated by our vision of what the forest can be and should be. And so we decided fairly early on that we were going to come up with our own alternative. And I suggested that we call it the citizens' preferred restoration alternative, because the Forest Service is legally required to choose the preferred alternative. And we wanted to preempt their choice of the logging alternative as the preferred alternative by adopting that term. And a couple of people said, "Oh, Andy, you can't do that." And then they ended up saying, "Yeah, why not?" So it became Citizens Preferred Alternative, CPA. And I don't like acronyms, as you may know, but anyway, I could live with the CPA. So we were determined that we were going to not work against the Buffalo Springs project. We were going to work in favor of an alternative vision for this extraordinary, with its amazing water resources, this amazing historical and cultural relevance, not just to Orange County, but to the state of Indiana and to the entire country, which I try to articulate. And that we were going to try and protect the karst. We were going to try and protect the endangered species. We were going to try and promote the development of old growth characteristics, because the Forest Service does this shell game where they talk about age class diversity, but their age class brackets stop at 140 years. So anything that's 140 years and older is just one age class. And there's like in 20-year increments, so 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, and so on up to 140. And then they do this inventory, and they thought that there should be as much forest in any given 10-year period in the 0 to 20 age class as in the 140 to infinity age class, which means that they completely discounted the fact that forests, the trees in our area, can grow to be 600 years old. So if they start doing true age class diversity, where it went from 140, and I think they jumped by 40-year increments further up the scale, but it's all about being able to monitor the forest from a computer without having to actually go on the ground. It's all about managing the map rather than knowing and interrogating the landscape to find out what the landscape knows, what the landscape has to offer, and what the landscape is capable of producing in terms of abundance for not just the human family and the human community, but for all the other communities that depend on the forest and are the forest. But so for them, it was like board feet. Now they didn't talk about it in those terms, but it was just a coincidence that one of the primary motives articulated for why they needed to do all this was to protect the oaks, because they're talking about how the oaks are disappearing from the forest. And we can go into that in more detail at some point. But surprisingly, when what they're talking about is protecting the oaks, more than half of the logging was going to be of oaks or in the oak-dominated forest. And so if you want to leave oaks in the forest, it seems to me you would leave the oaks in the forest and not cut them down and plan to replace them in another 200 years with other oaks. And that's what they were basically doing. And they were saying, I'll tell you what, you let us cut down this forest, and we promise you that in 200 years, you're going to have a beautiful, beautiful, healthy, diverse forest. That was what they were offering us. And so now I need to go to the incentives. And this is what I knew and could bring to the table. And I did more research and found out stuff that I hadn't known before, because the landscape has changed. But I think I mentioned that the Congress, in their infinite wisdom, has given the Forest Service all sorts of incentives to buy into this logging. And the management of the Forest Service at the upper echelons has certainly bought in, because what they depend on is congressional appropriations. So what the Congress will do is give the forests all the money they need to prepare and implement timber sales, provided, of course, that they come up with some rationale for those timber sales that doesn't require them to call them timber sales or to make money. Because what we did, one of the reasons we shut them down back in the 80s was because it was well documented that the that the Forest Service lost billions of dollars every year logging the national forest because they've already logged all the easy to get to stuff. They've already logged all the highest dollar value stuff. So anything else they're going to cut out of the national forest is going to be harder to get to. It's going to be lower value, and it's going to be harder to extract. So I'll talk about the two primary incentives here. The first primary incentive is the Congress has given the Forest Service 6 different funds into which they can deposit revenues from timber sales that allow the Forest Service to keep that money. And you better believe that the Forest Service knows how to use those incentives to maximize their benefit, the agency's benefit from cutting the timber. And Congress even goes further than that with this one that is the one that I think definitely deserves special mention. It's something called the Timber Sale Pipeline Restoration Fund, meaning that this is a fund, the money from which is used to prepare additional timber sales for additional restoration. And the sweethearts that they are, Congress said the Forest Service could use up to 25% of that money for recreation. And then they don't appropriate the money for recreation, or not nearly enough to provide for the backlog of projects requiring funding. So if the Forest Service, and this is, in their defense, if they want to do all these other things on their forest that would benefit recreational opportunities, they have to log the forest to get the money to provide the money for the recreational projects, or at least that's the framework within which all these things are proposed. And this goes back to the off-road vehicle trail issue from our previous conversation, in that the Forest Service justified the expense of the logging roads by claiming there's this huge demand for roaded recreation in the forest, that people want to run their off-road vehicles and their pickup trucks through the forest. Well, yeah, maybe they do, but is that a reason to log the forest and build logging roads into the heart of the wildest places left in the state of Indiana? Anyhow, so part of it is that the Forest Service gets to keep the money from cutting down the trees, and they are always, in their estimation, cash shy. They always need more money. And that's the nature of bureaucracies. Bureaucracies try to expand their budget, expand their turf, expand their competency and so forth. And it's just a known quantity. But the other way, and this is the bigger one these days, much bigger in many ways, is fire. That because of the horrific fires in Paradise, California and elsewhere in New Mexico, predominantly in western states, but it's also happening in Texas and Florida and other eastern states too. There are these monster wildfires consuming not just forest and wildlife and domestic animals and outbuildings, but taking homes, taking lives, taking entire communities. And Congress said, stop. Whatever you got to do to stop these fires from appearing on the nightly news broadcast, other than dealing with the underlying cause of climate change, mind you. Anything you can do that looks good on TV, like these valiant firefighters, with their hoses and these big planes dropping this hideous pink crap on the forest, do it. And here's $5 billion or whatever the number is. And back like 4 years ago, I think it was, more than half of the entire Forest Service budget was fire. And guess what? There's no amount of money, as I mentioned, other than dropping enough dollar bills on the fire to extinguish the flames, that you're going to put out these fires with money. What puts out these fires is changes in the weather. It's rainfall, it's snow, it's diminishment of the wind, it's hitting a major river or something. But I mean, these fires are jumping rivers, they're jumping roads. You get 60-mile-an-hour winds behind a fire in the dry western forest, there's nothing that's going to stop that fire. So the real issue out the west, and I'll just touch on this and then I'll let it go, is protecting homes and protecting communities, not trying to cut down the forest so it won't burn, which is their current preferred approach. They call it thinning, but they just happen to be thinning the trees that are most likely to survive the fire. Anyhow, so what that means is that there's an unlimited pot of money available for forests in the East if they can in any way justify or rationalize that activity in the name of fire. So whether it be, fire mitigation, fire prevention, fuel reduction, or ecosystem management. They claim, and there might be some validity to this, the oaks benefited from that abused and degraded landscape that was the Hoosier National Forest before it was the Hoosier National Forest. These abandoned farm fields, these heavily eroded hillsides, these washed out creeks, this, I mean, seriously abused and degraded landscape, but that still had pockets of beautiful forest, including old forest, scattered throughout. But so the Forest Service wants to burn every acre they can as often as possible to use the money, because if they design a large enough project that includes the fire, they can justify most of the activities as being fire related and tap into this basically unlimited reserve of funds to fund their operations. And if you're a forest supervisor, you want to maintain staff, you want to expand staff, you want to offer programs, you want to offer benefits, but all of those things require you to either make the compromises, or maybe for some of them, there's no compromise. They recognize what they're doing and they're perfectly fine with it. But you have to be able to justify cutting down that which you were being paid to protect in order to save it. You have to be able to justify incinerating thousands of turtles and salamanders and frogs and snails and other creatures whose lives are just as precious to them as our lives are to us, in the name of whatever, oak regeneration. Well, if you want to protect the oak component in the forest, it seems to me the single most logical thing to do would be to stop cutting them down, especially on the sites where oaks are already well established and the dominant seed tree species on those sites are the oaks. So we knew, or I was able to share with people, because I did some more research and found the numbers and so forth, and everybody realized, okay, yes, we've got the fight of our lives here, and we've got to get busy. And so we started going to commissioners' meetings and making impassioned pleas. And, at first, I mean, you could tell that the political landscape in our early meetings was a little fraught because, we're in a very political climate and there's all these divides that are accentuated and amplified by the media that are designed to make people feel like they're alienated and irreconcilably so with their neighbors if they happen to have different political beliefs. And we've been able to transcend that to such an amazing degree in this county to prove the lie of this notion that if you happen to vote for a Republican or you happen to vote for a Democrat, it means you cannot possibly have anything in common with the people who vote in a different way. So I offer the Forest Service my gratitude for forcing all of us together to find our common humanity in ways that have so enriched all of our lives. And sort of jumping to the chase here it is, what month are we in? July 15th, maybe something like that, of 2025. And a project that was supposed to be implemented in April of 2023 is still not. There's red marks all throughout the forest. And there has been one exception. They did cut some trees, and I'll get into that in a minute. But anyway, so we start working on our commissioners. We start working on the Patoka Lake Regional Sewer and Water District, going for the water. And we started working our elected representatives, one of whom at that time was Senator Mike Braun, who subsequently has become Governor Mike Braun. And little did I know that when he was in high school, he was the founder of their high school's ecology club. Mike had been a Democrat. He started out on the school board, and then he ran for, I think he got to the state legislature, then the state Senate, then the House of Representatives, and then the Senate. And fairly early on in the process, he'd shifted to being a Republican to more adequately reflect, I think, the makeup of the voters that he was representing. But back from when he was earliest a representative in the state house, Jeff Stant, who at that time was the executive director of the Hoosier Environmental Council, but when we pick up our story again with the Buffalo Springs Project, Jeff was the executive director of the Indiana Forest Alliance, an organization I helped to start back in 1996. Jeff had been cultivating a relationship with Mike because of Mike's personal affinity for the forest. I discovered, in part from Jeff, that Mike owns like close to 20,000 acres of forest land in various southern Indiana counties, and he manages them for timber. And so Mike was actually the first, when he was in the Senate, he was the first Republican senator to acknowledge the reality of climate change. Not the first, because I'm sure there were others before, but at that time, in the Trump era, he organized the Senate Republican Climate Caucus and found 5 or 6 other Republican senators to join him in that. So, this is to Mike's credit. Now, he's gone in ways I completely disagree with on numerous other issues, but on forest issues, Mike does it not just because it's popular with his constituency, but because he has a personal affinity for the forest. He likes to forage for mushrooms. He likes to spend time doing timber stand improvement. And he just likes being around those big old trees. And the Buffalo Trace runs right through his property, right where he lives. So Mike knows the forest in ways that other governors haven't, or maybe even couldn't. While he was in the Senate, he was able to get us not one, but 2 visits to Orange County by the number 2 person in the Department of Agriculture, the Undersecretary for Natural Resources and the Environment, who came specifically because Mike said, you need to hear from my constituents. And this was under the Biden administration, mind you. So this guy named Homer Wilkes comes to Orange County, and the first time it's just a small meeting, and the Forest Service tries to hijack the meeting, where they say, there's going to be so many of these environmentalists, and we're going to have 20 of our resource specialists to explain to the undersecretary why this is exactly the right thing to do. And Jeff talked to Braun, and Braun's staff talked to the Forest Service, said, no, we'll tell you who's coming. We'll bring 6 people, but you are going to give them a chance to say what they need to say. So we had this meeting set up as at this Springs Valley Horse Trail trailhead, and the Forest Service has all their dog and pony show prepared, where they're going to stop at these different places and show to us why this is blah, 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 and why this is blah, blah, blah. And when Braun gets there, we say, no, that was not the deal. This is our meeting. We called this meeting. So I was there with 6 baby possums. And I mentioned Robbie, because one of the things I want to say about Robbie, one day Robbie comes to one of our meetings with this shirt. It says on the front, say Hoosier National Forest. On the back, it says "Stop the BS Project," and that's another gift that the Forest Service gave us. There were two great gifts. One is that they gave us a project whose initials are BS, without even realizing they'd done that, which worked to our advantage, needless to say. But they also gave us this beautiful name, Buffalo Springs. I mean, this is the iconic North American mammal. It is the national mammal of the people of the United States. And it also happens to be just an iconic species that speaks to what is wild and wonderful and beautiful about this North American continent. And then they gave us the springs. What is more elemental than water that just flows directly from the rocks in the ground to where you can just bend down? And I think I may have mentioned this before, but if I did or I didn't, it bears repeating. There's nothing I love more than walking in the woods. Of course, I usually love to have my dogs with me, but we'll go for a long walk in the woods and we'll find every spring. And I carry a little quarter cup measuring cup in my pocket, a little stainless steel cup. And I just love to, I'll dip it from my hands, but there's something very satisfying about using this little cup with a little handle and dipping it in the spring and just taking that spring. Magical. And to know that you could drink the water. How many places in this country can you just go and drink the water? People are afraid of the water. People are afraid of the sun. To some extent, people are afraid of the forest. People are afraid of snakes. They're afraid of spiders. There's all these bugaboos that you have to get past to get people reconnected to the planet of which they are made. This right here, that's the earth. This is the earth. All this is the earth just up and walking about in human form. So the water reminds us of that. The water, the spring, the notion of the spring, both meanings of the spring, the season, and of course the other meaning, the bouncy thing. All these things speak to something very elemental. The water that flows from the earth, the renewal each year of the seasons and the regrowth of the greenery as the winter's cold and dark fades into or transitions into this amazing efflorescence, the buzzing of the insects, the chirping of the birds. And here in the forest, spring is a very different experience than it is elsewhere. Because, I mean, I think you'll remember this back after the horrific attacks of September 11th, when the airlines were shut down. And I'm sorry for the reason, but boy, that was some of the best time to be in the forest. Is not a single airplane in the sky. I cannot tell you what a blessing is. And I'll give you another little aside, and this one is heartbreaking. Since they proposed the Buffalo Springs project, UPS has opened a vastly expanded distribution hub in Louisville, Kentucky, and we're in the flight path. So all night long, every night, but especially before Christmas, engines, jet engines over our house, essentially downshifting, making horrific noise. One of the most beautiful things about living in the forest is the sound of the nighttime in the winter. You want to experience silence? Get in a forest at night in the winter. It won't be silent. There'll be wolves. There'll be something. But guess what? Everything that you sense in that frame touches you on this very deep, fundamental human level, animal level, biochemical level, to remind you of that you are part of something much larger than yourself. You're not separate. That thing only exists because you were there to experience it. That is the nature of life in the forest. That thing exists for you and because of you, and you exist for it and because of it. It's not two separate things. You are of the earth. And of course, I would add that you're also of the starlight and the sunlight. And what motivates the sun lives also within you. That light is your birthright. You have that light within you. Hello, Care.
Can I make you some food?
Please do. That would be awesome. Thank you. So these airplanes are a great source of distress for me, but I'm never going to learn to live with them, but I'm going to continue living as long as I can, but they certainly aren't doing anything for my quality of life. I can sort of cut to the chase at this point. The Forest Service, they thought they had this thing in the bag. And what's interesting is, like I said, they put out this document describing this magical place, and then what do they think to do with this magical place? Log it and burn it. That's it. We were able to come up with our citizens' preferred alternative. We took it around, and in short order, we got the local economic development partnership to sign off on our proposal. We got the Chamber of Commerce to sign off on our proposal. We got the county commissioners of Orange County to sign off on our proposal. We got the commissioners of Crawford County to sign off on our proposal. We got the Economic Development Corporation of Crawford County to sign off on our proposal. We got Save Historic Orange County to sign off on our proposal. And most significant, considering how rare this is, we got the Farm Bureau to sign off on our proposal. The Farm Bureau, just like Mike Braun, with whom we would disagree on numerous other issues, has taken the right position for the right reasons, for the water. Because one of their primary policy priorities right now is the water. Part of that is protecting the farmers' ability to do what they need to do with the water that runs through their land so that they continue farming. But nonetheless, water is the issue, one of their issues. Every one of these organizations, for the most part, that we got to sign on to our proposal are predominantly Trump supporting Republicans. So this makes us very unique, not just in Indiana, but in the country, that we have been able to mobilize a concerted effort on part of a broad base of the citizenry, representing 70% of the people, irrespective of political affiliation, who would like to see this tiny gem of a forest. And it's a gem, but it happens to be the highest quality hardwood forest between the Appalachians and the Ozarks. And not just because it is, but because we protected it and kept it standing. And I think there's a recognition now. I think there's a pride in Orange County that we did it. We in Orange County still have a forest that's worth cutting down because we kept them from cutting it down before. And it's way worth cutting down in terms of the money that's out there for white oaks right now. It's obscene. And the principal driver of this white oak demand is barrel staves for bourbon. You know, the principal driver of the logging of Buffalo Springs is barrel staves for bourbon for export. And what's interesting, of course, is that there's a bourbon called Buffalo Trace. And my dear friend Dave Cooper recently found cast off on a sidewalk in Lexington, Kentucky, this beautiful, looks like bronze, but it's actually some fiberglass or something, buffalo. And he said, Andy, I think you need to have this. So he brought it up to me for my birthday. And but so this buffalo, the connection between the buffalo, the oaks, and the forest, it's been intriguing and fascinating. Maybe we had all this support from the commissioners. With the support from the commissioners, Mike Braun was able to take a much more public position than he probably would have if there'd been anything remotely like opposition or even neutrality. So we gave Mike permission to express what he really wanted, and that's to have the whole forest protected. And then we got another letter from Mike Braun on June 28th when we had a rally at the Forest Service office. And this letter, he specifically praised Protect Our Woods for taking the actions that we've taken to protect the public forest. So we've got very strong support from our governor. And while the Trump administration is dedicated to cutting as much timber off the national forest as possible, I believe it's fair to say most of the impact will be out west. That doesn't justify it, doesn't make it right, and we will do everything in our power to help those dear people working and struggling to protect the forest they love, and we are already committed to doing that. But for the time being, Buffalo Springs and maybe even the entire Hoosier National Forest has gotten another respite. They still say they're going to implement it in July of 2025. That's on their website. They're going to implement Buffalo Springs in July of 2025. We shall see. You know, there's not a bill in Congress. There's not a lawsuit with a decided outcome that resulted in that outcome. It's the people said, do not. You will not take our forest. You will not take our forest. You will not take our forest. That's what the people said. And they said it with conviction because it's a heartfelt position, and we are dedicated to making sure that doesn't happen. So now what that's allowed me to do is reflect on the fact that back in October of last year or thereabouts, I made a conscious decision that I could not continue to both fight cancer and fight the Forest Service. And it was my belief that it would be easier to fight cancer in a protected forest than to live in a destroyed and degraded forest, whatever my physical health. So Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, that's where we start. But just like with Heartwood, the plan is to get those three forests completely protected: the Wayne, the Daniel Boone, the Mark Twain, to the coasts.
Is there a call to action that you would have anybody listening to this? Where would you send them, or what would you want for somebody to do who wants to be involved?
I would encourage them to go to the Save Hoosier National Forest website, to the Save Hoosier National Forest Facebook page, or to contact Stephen Stewart at Protect Our Woods. If you're on Facebook or you're on the internet, just look up Protect Our Woods. You should find Stephen Stewart's contact information. Stephen is now working with a guy named Jim Braytell. I don't know if I mentioned Jim, but Jim has been analyzing successful citizen movements going back to the abolition movement through suffrage, labor, civil rights, and so forth, and finding those things that unite all these movements through time, even with changing technology, changing social norms and all that. What are the essential elements? And Jim believes he has a roadmap for us to achieve our objective of securing complete protection for a tiny, publicly owned national forest in a deeply red county, in a deeply red state, by mobilizing an unprecedented expression of public sentiment. And I believe it can work. I don't know that there's anything else that can, and Jim doesn't think he's found anything else that would work. So please contact Protect Our Woods. You can also contact Heartwood, of course. Heartwood is integrally involved in all these conversations. And if you happen to be in Indiana, the Indiana Forest Alliance deserves your support. So any support you can provide or active engagement you can offer through either Protect Our Woods, which is primarily local, regional to Southern Indiana, Indiana Forest Alliance, the entire state of Indiana, or Heartwood, anywhere in the Heartwood region, but also Heartwood is tied into these other networks nationally. So if you're anywhere in the country, I encourage you to tie into the Heartwood network because you will find family there. No matter what your background is, no matter what your political affiliation, you will find family in Heartwood if you love forests and if you love like breathing air and drinking water.
Thank you. And we'll put all that information in the show notes so people will be able to find it easily. Thank you so much, Andy.
Jillian, I love you. Thank you so much. It's just a joy to be able to speak with you as one of my closest friends in a way that I hope will reach people who we've never even met.
Me too. Me too. I love you too.
I love you. See ya.
Bye.